He woke up as the novel's Clingy Omega, then sent every love letter to the wrong prince. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, it is free, and it is the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic and emotional stories like this one. Your support truly means the world to us. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and what time it is where you are right now. We love seeing how far these stories travel and knowing who is joining us today. Now, let's begin today's story. If I am really trapped inside this novel, then I have exactly one rule. I am not spending my second life begging a prince to love me. Aiden Blake stared at the handwritten page on his desk and wondered whether waking in another man's body was somehow less humiliating than discovering what that man had been writing before breakfast. My beloved Prince Julian, your absence has turned every hour into winter. Aiden closed his eyes. Absolutely not. Unfortunately, the bedroom around him refused to disappear. Morning sunlight poured through tall windows onto blue silk curtains, polished furniture, and enough embroidered cushions to bankrupt a reasonable person. A silver mirror confirmed the impossible truth. The face looking back at him belonged to Aiden Blake, the 23-year-old Omega from The Crown Between Us, a romance novel he had finished reading 3 nights ago. Worse, Aiden was not the hero. He was the Clingy Omega readers were supposed to pity, then dislike, then forget. In the original story, Aiden spent months pursuing Prince Julian Ashford, sending letters, appearing at royal events, and interpreting basic courtesy as affection. Julian eventually rejected him publicly. Society laughed. Aiden's family finances collapsed soon afterward, and his final appearance consisted of him leaving the capital alone. That was it. No redemption. No second chance. No explanation. Just several hundred pages of bad decisions followed by disappearance. The new Aiden had no intention of cooperating. He gathered the unfinished letters from the desk and tied them with ribbon. Congratulations, fictional destiny. You are cancelled. A knock sounded at the door. His family secretary entered carrying a cream envelope stamped with the royal seal. Mr. Blake, an invitation from the palace. The winter court opens Friday evening. Prince Julian will attend. Of course he will. Aiden accepted the invitation while memories that did not belong to him surfaced naturally. His family owned several properties outside the capital, but falling agricultural income had created serious financial pressure. The original Aiden had believed marrying Julian could rescue both his reputation and his family. That explained the desperation, although it did not make the strategy better. Then another memory from the novel struck him. Winter Court. A forged trade memorandum. In the book, nobody discovered the document was false until months later. By then, tariffs had damaged several northern towns, a diplomatic dispute had begun, and the royal government blamed the wrong official. Aiden sat down slowly. He remembered exactly which detail exposed the forgery. The document referenced a shipping office that had changed its official name 2 years earlier. He could ignore it. Stay quiet. Avoid Julian. Protect himself. That would be the safest choice. But thousands of people in this world were no longer printed names on pages. They were real now. Aiden looked at the abandoned love letters. An idea formed. Prince Julian served on the Royal Trade Council. Aiden could send him a warning. But nobody would believe an obscure Omega claiming knowledge he should not possess. A personal letter, however, would reach him without attracting attention. Aiden pulled out fresh paper. He wrote only enough romantic language to make the message appear harmless, then carefully explained where Julian should look in the trade memorandum and why the shipping reference was impossible. He asked for nothing in return. No meeting. No favor. No affection. When he finished, Aiden sealed the envelope and addressed it simply to His Royal Highness, Prince Julian Ashford, private correspondence. At the palace that afternoon, 2 royal mail trays stood beside each other beneath nearly identical brass plaques. A hurried clerk placed Aiden's envelope into the wrong one. Hours later, in a private office overlooking the palace gardens, Prince Alexander Hawthorne broke the seal. Alexander was 31, an alpha, the king's eldest son, and a man whose reputation could silence a ballroom before he entered it. Tall, broad-shouldered, controlled, and famously difficult to impress, he had spent years receiving letters filled with political flattery and carefully disguised requests. He recognized Aiden Blake's name immediately. Everyone at court knew about the Omega hopelessly devoted to his younger half-brother. Alexander almost returned the letter unopened. Then one sentence caught his attention. If your highness wishes to protect the northern trade districts, examine the shipping office named on page 14 before Friday's council vote. Alexander read the sentence twice. Then he read the entire letter again. By sunset, a royal investigator confirmed that the shipping reference was outdated and the memorandum was almost certainly forged. Alexander leaned back in his chair, looking at Aiden's signature. The kingdom believed Aiden Blake was a foolish Omega chasing a prince who did not want him. Yet the first letter Alexander had ever received from him had just prevented a serious political mistake. Alexander placed the letter inside his private desk instead of forwarding it to Julian. For the first time in years, the powerful Alpha Prince found himself waiting to see whether someone would write to him again. By Friday morning, Aiden had convinced himself that the missing reply was good news. Prince Julian had probably read the warning, investigated quietly, and decided that answering a supposedly lovesick Omega would only encourage him. That suited Aiden perfectly. He had no desire to recreate the original Aiden's embarrassing reputation. Then the morning newspaper arrived. Buried beneath reports about winter court preparations was a short announcement stating that the Royal Trade Council had suspended the disputed Northern Memorandum after discovering irregularities in its documentation. Aiden nearly spilled his coffee. It worked. More importantly, nobody had been blamed publicly, which meant someone had handled the problem intelligently instead of turning it into court theater. Aiden should have stopped there. Unfortunately, he remembered what happened next in the novel. Within 3 weeks, a supplier named Westbridge & Cole would win an enormous contract to provide winter grain to several northern districts. The company would deliver less than promised while charging the crown for the full amount. The scandal would not become public until spring. Aiden stared at his breakfast. I hate knowing spoilers when the spoilers involve actual people's lives. By noon, he was writing again. This time he disguised the warning inside a politely affectionate letter, suggesting that Prince Julian examine warehouse capacity before approving any supplier claiming to store more than 60,000 bushels near the Northern Rail Depot. Aiden remembered enough from the novel to know that Westbridge and Cole possessed nowhere near that capacity. At the palace, the same correspondence clerk who had misdirected the first letter saw Aiden Blake's seal and confidently repeated his mistake. The envelope landed on Alexander Hawthorne's desk before dinner. Alexander read it once, then summoned the procurement records. By midnight, his staff had discovered that Westbridge & Cole had exaggerated its storage capacity by nearly 40%. Alexander did not smile often, but when he looked at Aiden's letter again, amusement touched his expression. 2 warnings could still be coincidence. 3 would become a pattern. He took out plain stationery without a royal crest and wrote a single question. If a man recognizes a problem before everyone else, does he have an obligation to speak even when speaking may damage his reputation? The unsigned reply reached Bennett House the following afternoon. Aiden read it 3 times. He assumed Julian had finally answered discreetly. The question was unexpectedly thoughtful. Aiden sat at his desk and wrote back. A reputation can recover. People harmed by silence may not. If you have evidence, speak carefully. If you only have suspicion, investigate first. Do not confuse certainty with courage. Alexander received the response that evening. He read the final sentence twice. Most people who wrote to princes tried to sound impressive. Aiden seemed more interested in being useful. Their correspondence continued. Alexander asked whether tradition deserved obedience merely because it was old. Aiden replied that age could prove endurance, not wisdom. Alexander asked whether authority made a person responsible for every problem he could see. Aiden answered that power did not create infinite responsibility, but it did remove certain excuses. Aiden believed he was exchanging private thoughts with Julian. Alexander knew perfectly well that the letters were meant for someone else, yet each new page made forwarding them more difficult. He told himself he was preserving useful intelligence. He told himself the kingdom benefited from Aiden's observations. He absolutely did not admit that he had begun recognizing Aiden's handwriting before seeing the signature. On Thursday evening, another letter arrived. This one contained no political warning at all. Aiden had written about loneliness. Not dramatically, but honestly. He confessed that sometimes being known for the worst version of yourself made improvement feel invisible. Alexander stopped reading for several seconds. Court gossip had reduced Aiden Blake to a joke long before Alexander had ever spoken to him. Yet the man inside these letters was observant, compassionate, funny, and painfully aware of his own reputation. Alexander finally wrote a longer reply. Perhaps becoming different does not require convincing everyone who remembers who you were. Perhaps it begins with deciding whose judgment deserves access to who you are becoming. When Aiden read those words the next morning, something unexpected warmed inside his chest. For the first time since waking in this strange world, he felt understood. At the palace, Alexander folded Aiden's latest letter and placed it beside the others in his locked desk. Neither man realized that Winter Court was only hours away from placing them in the same ballroom. The Winter Court ballroom looked exactly as Aiden remembered from the novel, which was deeply inconvenient because the novel had never mentioned how difficult it was to think beneath 12 chandeliers and the judgment of several hundred aristocrats. He entered beside his family, determined to remain invisible, but whispers followed him almost immediately. Everyone remembered the old Aiden Blake, the Omega who had pursued Prince Julian with enough determination to become court entertainment. Aiden ignored them. Tonight he needed only one thing: confirmation that Julian had understood their correspondence. Across the ballroom, Julian stood near a marble column speaking with two young nobles. He was handsome in the polished, effortless way the novel had described, but seeing him in person produced none of the emotional reaction Aiden expected from the body's inherited memories. That was probably healthy. When Julian finally noticed him approaching, his pleasant expression became guarded. "Mr. Blake, Your Highness." Aiden lowered his voice. "I wanted to thank you for taking my concerns seriously." Julian frowned. "Your concerns?" Aiden's confidence weakened. "The Northern Memorandum. And Westbridge and Cole." Julian stared at him blankly. "I am afraid I do not know what you mean." Aiden felt the floor disappear beneath his dignity. "The letters." Julian's expression changed instantly. "Mr. Blake, if this concerns the letters you used to send me, I believed we had already established that I could not return your feelings." Several nearby guests had begun listening. "Perfect. Absolutely perfect." Aiden forced himself to remain calm. "I understand. There has apparently been a misunderstanding." "I hope so." Julian's tone was not cruel, but the pity in it was somehow worse. "I wish you well, Aiden. Truly. But I cannot encourage this." Aiden stepped back. Every letter, every thoughtful reply, every conversation he had believed was rebuilding his reputation with Julian had gone somewhere else. Then who had answered him? "Do not confuse certainty with courage." The voice came from behind him. Aiden froze. He knew those words. He had written them himself. Slowly he turned. Prince Alexander Hawthorne stood. Several feet away, the room seemed to reorganize itself around his presence. He was taller than Aiden expected, broad-shouldered beneath a formal black coat, with dark hair, composed gray eyes, and the unmistakable confidence of an alpha who had never needed to demand attention because people gave it automatically. In the novel, Alexander had been described as distant, intimidating, and politically severe. He was also the king's eldest son and the last person Aiden would have chosen for accidental romantic correspondence. Alexander approached. "Your Highness," Aiden managed. "Mr. Blake." Aiden lowered his voice. "You received my letters." "Every one. And you answered them." "Everyone that asked for an answer." Aiden wanted to disappear behind the nearest curtain. "They were addressed to Prince Julian." "I noticed. Why did you not tell me?" Alexander considered the question rather than hiding behind rank. "At first, because your first letter contained information requiring immediate investigation. After that, because I wanted to understand how you knew what you knew. And later, for the first time, Alexander's composure shifted. Later became more complicated. Aiden stared at him. "I accidentally sent private letters to the wrong prince for weeks." "Yes. You could have corrected this after the first one." "Yes. This is horrifying. For what it is worth, I found it unusually interesting." Aiden almost laughed despite himself. "That does not help." Alexander glanced toward the guests still pretending not to watch them. "Then perhaps this will. Your warning prevented the forged memorandum from reaching a council vote. Your second letter exposed false warehouse records before a contract was signed. Whatever embarrassment you feel tonight, those outcomes remain real." Aiden's humiliation softened slightly. Alexander continued, "And your letters were never foolish. Aiden looked up. Court gossip says otherwise. Court gossip also believed Westbridge and Cole could store 60,000 bushels in warehouses that hold barely half that amount. Aiden smiled before he could stop himself. Alexander's expression warmed almost imperceptibly. There. That is. Closer to the man who writes to me. The words landed differently than they should have. Aiden suddenly understood that Alexander had not merely read his warnings. He had noticed the person behind them. What happens now? Aiden asked. Alexander could easily have answered with authority. Instead, he gave Aiden the decision. That depends entirely on you. You may stop writing. You may continue anonymously. Or, if you prefer, you may speak to me directly. Aiden glanced toward Julian, then back at the prince who had actually listened. For the first time since entering this novel, the wrong turn in the story did not feel like a mistake. The morning after Winter Court, Aiden discovered that embarrassment survived sleep remarkably well. By breakfast, 3 society papers had already reported his conversation with Julian, each version somehow making him sound more desperate than the last. One claimed he had crossed the ballroom to renew his romantic pursuit. Another described Alexander's intervention as an act of royal mercy. Aiden folded the papers and pushed them away. Apparently facts are optional before noon. What bothered him was not the gossip itself. The old Aiden had spent years teaching society to expect exactly this story from him. What bothered him was how quickly everyone accepted the familiar version without asking whether he had changed. Shortly after 10, a palace messenger arrived carrying a sealed envelope. Aiden recognized Alexander's handwriting immediately. No romantic language appeared inside. No command either. Alexander simply invited him to the palace library at 2 and added one sentence. If you would rather end our correspondence here, I will respect that decision. Aiden stared at those words longer than necessary. The novel had portrayed Alexander Hawthorne as a cold alpha prince who expected obedience because authority followed him everywhere. Yet the real Alexander kept doing something inconveniently inconsistent with that description. He gave choices. At 2, Aiden entered the palace library and found Alexander alone beside a long table covered with maps and government reports. You came, Alexander said. I considered moving to another country. That seemed excessive. You did accidentally become the recipient of my imaginary courtship. Your letters contained remarkably little courtship. Aiden narrowed his eyes. You sound disappointed. Alexander's mouth almost curved. I said no such thing. The tension eased. Aiden remained several feet away. Why did you really keep answering? Alexander looked toward the letters arranged beside his papers. Because everyone who writes to me wants something from the prince. Influence. Money. Access. Protection. You wrote as though my title mattered less than whether I made intelligent decisions. I thought you were Julian. That detail continues to injure my dignity. Aiden laughed despite himself. Alexander continued. But even believing you were writing to him, you asked for nothing personally. Aiden's expression softened. I already know what happens when someone builds his entire future around being chosen by a prince. Alexander did not understand the literal meaning, but he understood enough not to interrupt. Aiden walked toward the window. People here decided who I was before I woke up to the consequences. Clingy. Foolish. Desperate. Sometimes I wonder whether changing matters if nobody allows you to become different. It matters, Alexander said. Even if nobody notices? Especially then. Otherwise, improvement becomes another performance for an audience. Aiden turned. That sounded exactly like the man from the letters. Not the intimidating royal figure described in the novel. Not the alpha court gossip feared. Just Alexander. The book was wrong about you, Aiden murmured. What book? Aiden's heart stopped for half a second. Nothing. An expression from childhood. Alexander clearly noticed the weak explanation, but he did not press. Instead, he moved a report across the table. There is another matter. A proposed inheritance regulation reaches committee next week. It allows appointed family guardians greater authority over property belonging to unmarried Omegas. Aiden remembered that law. In the novel, it had seemed like background world building. Later, several Omega families quietly lost control of inherited businesses. Who proposed it? Lord Mercer. Aiden knew that name too. The future scandal was supposed to begin with him. Alexander watched Aiden's face carefully. You recognize it. Aiden could lie, but something about their letters had made dishonesty feel harder. I know enough to believe you should investigate before supporting him. Alexander nodded once. No demand for impossible explanations. No accusation. Then we investigate. Aiden looked at him. You trust me that easily? No. Alexander's answer was calm. I trust the pattern of your judgment. There is a difference. For reasons Aiden could not explain, that meant more. He stepped closer to the table. All right, show me the proposal. Alexander moved beside him, powerful enough to command the entire room, yet careful not to command Aiden. As they began reading, Aiden realized something unsettling. The novel had taught him exactly which prince he was supposed to chase and exactly which prince he was supposed to fear. So far, it had been wrong about both. For the next 4 days, Aiden and Alexander treated Lord Mercer's inheritance proposal like a puzzle designed by someone who assumed nobody would read the smallest print. The official language sounded protective. Unmarried Omegas with inherited property could receive temporary guardianship assistance during periods of financial uncertainty. Aiden understood immediately why most readers would overlook it. Nothing sounded threatening until Alexander brought out the accompanying administrative rules. There, Aiden said, tapping one paragraph. The guardian can approve long-term property agreements without separate consent. Alexander leaned closer to read. Only when necessary to preserve the estate. Who decides what necessary means? Alexander looked at him. The appointed guardian. Exactly. Aiden turned another page. And who recommends the guardian? The regional family board. Who appoints that board? Alexander became very still. Mercer's committee. Aiden sat back. That is not protection. That is a beautifully dressed conflict of interest. Alexander ordered a quiet review of previous cases connected to Mercer. By the following afternoon, clerks had identified 11 Omega-owned estates that had entered similar arrangements under older local regulations. 7 had eventually transferred valuable contracts to businesses connected with board members. The discovery should have made Aiden feel victorious. Instead, it frightened him. In the novel, those families had barely existed beyond background references. Here, every forgotten sentence represented real people. I used to think knowing the story gave me an advantage, Aiden admitted that evening. He and Alexander were alone in the library again, surrounded by documents. Now it feels like being handed a map where every road leads towards something I failed to notice the first time. Alexander studied him carefully. You speak about this world as though you have seen another version of it. Aiden's pulse quickened. Would you believe me if I said I had? I would listen. The answer was so simple that Aiden almost told him everything. Almost. I am not ready. Alexander nodded and returned to the records. No interrogation followed. No alpha authority filled the silence. Aiden realized that Alexander's restraint affected him more deeply than grand declarations ever could. You really are terrible at being the frightening prince everyone warned me about. Alexander glanced sideways. I can become more unpleasant if it would improve your experience. Please do not strain yourself. Alexander laughed, quietly but genuinely, and Aiden felt an unexpected warmth at having caused it. Then a clerk entered with another file. The latest investigation showed that Mercer planned to introduce the inheritance proposal 3 days earlier than publicly announced. Alexander read the notice. He knows someone is examining the records. Then he will try to pass it before we understand the entire network. Probably. Aiden looked at the 11 estates again. In the original story, Prince Julian had supported Mercer's proposal because his advisors described it as routine reform. Alexander, meanwhile, had been absent from the vote for reasons the novel never explained. You cannot be absent from the committee meeting, Aiden said. Alexander's eyes narrowed. Why would I be? Aiden remembered the next chapter with sudden clarity. A royal delegation from Belmont would arrive tomorrow morning. Alexander would be sent north to receive them because the king considered him the stronger diplomat. Mercer would use his absence. Because tomorrow someone is going to give you an excellent reason to leave the capital. Alexander did not ask how Aiden knew. And if I refuse? They will know you suspect something. Alexander considered this, then slowly smiled. So I should leave. Aiden stared. That is the opposite of what I just said. Publicly, yes. Alexander moved a blank sheet of paper toward him. Privately, we need someone Mercer does not consider politically dangerous. Aiden looked down at the paper, then back at Alexander. You mean me? I mean the man who found what my advisors missed. The words settled between them. For most of Aiden's life in this world, people had underestimated him because they thought they already knew his story. For For the first time, that prejudice might become useful. Aiden picked up the pen. All right, let Mercer keep believing I am only a foolish Omega. Alexander's expression hardened with quiet confidence. And when he realizes his mistake? Aiden smiled. By then, I intend to have read every page he hoped nobody would notice. The following morning unfolded almost exactly as Aiden remembered. Before breakfast ended, palace bells announced the arrival of the Belmont delegation, and by 9 o'clock a royal messenger confirmed that Alexander had been asked to travel north with them for several days. Publicly, Alexander accepted without objection. Privately, he left Aiden one final note containing only 4 words: trust what you notice. Aiden folded it into his coat pocket before entering the public records office near the Eastern Palace Gate. Nobody stopped him. That was the advantage of being underestimated. The clerks knew him as Aiden Blake. The Omega Society papers still described as hopelessly obsessed with Prince Julian. They assumed he was researching family matters, not examining legislation that could reshape property rights across the kingdom. For 6 hours, Aiden compared Mercer's proposal with older guardianship agreements. At first, he found exactly what he expected: repeated appointments, suspicious contracts, and the same small circle of businesses receiving favorable terms. Then he noticed something that had never appeared in the novel. 3 companies connected to those agreements shared the same accounting office. Aiden requested the public registration records. The clerk hesitated. Those files are rarely requested. Then they should be delighted someone finally appreciates them. The clerk stared at him, then handed them over. Aiden discovered that the accounting office also represented Westbridge and Cole, the supplier Alexander had investigated after receiving Aiden's second letter. His stomach tightened. The forged trade memorandum, the false warehouse capacity, and Mercer's inheritance proposal were not separate problems. Someone had been building influence through multiple government systems at once. Aiden copied the registration numbers, dates, and directors' names before returning home after sunset. A letter from Alexander was already waiting. The Belmont delegation had unexpectedly raised concerns about northern shipping contracts. Alexander suspected their visit had been arranged to keep him occupied, while Mercer accelerated the committee vote. Aiden answered immediately. You were right about the distraction, but we were wrong about the scale. Follow the accounting office connected to Westbridge and Cole. Mercer is not protecting one proposal. He is protecting a network. He stopped before sealing the envelope. Weeks ago, he would have hidden the warning beneath embarrassing romantic language. Now he simply signed his name. Alexander received the letter the next afternoon and ordered his staff to examine the financial connections without canceling his diplomatic schedule. Within 24 hours, they found payments linking 2 regional board members, a shipping broker, and one of Mercer's senior advisors. But something else changed. Alexander's actions prevented events Aiden remembered from the novel. The Belmont negotiations did not collapse. The grain contract never reached Westbridge and Cole. An Omega family that should have lost control of its textile business retained ownership after a questionable guardianship request was suspended. Aiden sat alone in his study that evening, realizing the terrifying consequence. The future was no longer following the book. His knowledge had become less reliable with every decision they changed. When Alexander returned to the capital 2 days later, Aiden told him immediately, I cannot keep predicting what comes next. Alexander removed his gloves and studied him. Were you predicting it before? Aiden exhaled. He had finally reached the question he could not avoid forever. Yes. Alexander waited. Aiden expected suspicion, demands, perhaps even fear. Instead, Alexander asked, Are you trying to protect people? Yes. Are you deliberately misleading me? No. Alexander nodded. Then tell me the rest when you are ready. Aiden stared at him. That is all. No. I have approximately 50 questions. Aiden almost laughed. Why are you not asking them? Alexander's answer came quietly. Because trust does not mean I am entitled to every secret you have. Something inside Aiden shifted. In the novel, powerful alphas were constantly described through possession. Their estates, their titles, their influence. Even the Omega Society expected them to claim. Alexander possessed more power than almost anyone Aiden had met. Yet his most compelling strength was the power he chose not to use. Aiden stepped closer. The world I remember said you were cold. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Your mysterious world sounds poorly informed. It was. Aiden smiled. About several things. Alexander held his gaze, and for a moment neither man mentioned Mercer, legislation, or political conspiracies. Then a palace clerk hurried into the room carrying a sealed notice. The committee vote had been moved again. It would take place tomorrow morning. Alexander opened the notice and frowned. Mercer knows time is against him. Aiden looked at the evidence spread across the table. The story he remembered could no longer tell him how tomorrow would end. For the first time, that did not frighten him. Good, he said. Then tomorrow we stop following the story and write our own. By sunrise, the committee chamber was already crowded. Lord Mercer had moved quickly, filling the room with advisors who spoke confidently about tradition, stability, and the supposed need to protect vulnerable Omegas from difficult financial decisions. Aiden sat among the observers, deliberately quiet. Nobody seemed concerned that the supposedly clingy Omega had been studying their proposal for days. That was exactly what he wanted. Mercer presented the inheritance regulation as a compassionate reform. No responsible society should leave young Omegas exposed to predatory agreements, he declared. Aiden almost laughed at the irony. The proposal was designed to give guardians greater control over precisely the people it claimed to protect. When the committee opened the floor for questions, Aiden stood. Several heads turned. One noble whispered something that made another smile. Aiden ignored them. I have 3 questions about the financial safeguards. Mercer looked mildly amused. Of course, Mr. Blake. Aiden placed copies of the documents on the table. Why does the proposal allow appointed guardians to approve long-term property agreements without independent review? Mercer answered that experienced guardians could act more efficiently. Then why do 11 estates under similar arrangements show transfers to businesses connected to regional board members? The room became quieter. Mercer dismissed the records as unrelated. Aiden placed another document beside them. Why does the accounting office representing those businesses also represent Westbridge and Cole? Several committee members exchanged uneasy looks. Mercer turned toward the royal representatives. This is irresponsible speculation from an emotionally involved petitioner. Aiden nodded. Yes, I am personally affected. That is why I brought documents instead of asking you to trust my feelings. The answer unsettled the room. Then a senior clerk entered carrying original registration records requested by Alexander. The clerk confirmed the company connections. Mercer attempted to object, but the committee chair ordered the documents reviewed. Aiden continued calmly. He explained the timeline, the shared accounting office, the questionable guardianship transfers, and the proposed regulation that would have expanded the same network's authority. Nothing depended on his mysterious knowledge of the future anymore. Everything could be verified. That was when Mercer changed tactics. Your Majesty, he said, turning toward Alexander. Surely this chamber should not be manipulated by a man who admits he knows things he could not possibly know. The room fell silent. Aiden's heart tightened. Alexander could end the discussion with a single royal declaration, but doing so would prove Mercer's accusation that Aiden survived only through royal favor. Instead, Alexander looked at Aiden. Would you like to answer? Aiden understood immediately. The choice was his. He stood straight. I do know things I cannot fully explain. I also know that unexplained knowledge is not proof of wrongdoing. That is why I have stopped asking anyone to believe me. I am asking you to examine what can be proven. The chair requested a vote to suspend the proposal pending independent investigation. The result was decisive. The regulation failed to advance. Mercer did not lose his position immediately, but his influence had changed. For the first time, his network had been placed under scrutiny. Outside the chamber, Aiden found Alexander waiting. You did not defend me, Aiden said. Alexander looked almost amused. You did not need defending. Aiden smiled. That might be the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me. Alexander stepped closer, but stopped before invading Aiden's space. There is something else. He held out one of Aiden's earliest letters. You wrote that power should be measured by what someone chooses not to take. Aiden recognized the sentence. I remember. Alexander folded the letter carefully. I used to think strength meant never allowing anyone to challenge me. You have made me reconsider that. Aiden looked at him. And I used to think being chosen by a prince would solve everything. Alexander waited. It does not, Aiden continued. Being respected is much better. Their eyes met, and neither needed to pretend the connection between them was still only correspondence. Then Alexander said quietly, I am beginning to think I received the wrong letter at exactly the right time. The victory in the committee chamber lasted less than a day before Aidan discovered that Lord Mercer had left behind something far more troubling than a failed proposal. Alexander summoned him to the Royal Archive that evening, where a sealed collection of old records had been placed on a long oak table. These were found in a restricted section this afternoon, Alexander said. They concern the inheritance regulations you have been studying. Aidan opened the first file and immediately recognized a name from the novel. Alexander Hawthorne. His hands went still. Why is your name here? Alexander looked at the document with an expression Aidan had never seen before. That is what I want to understand. The record was dated 12 years earlier, when Alexander had been 19. It described a proposed succession reform that would have given the eldest prince greater authority over several royal councils. Yet beside Alexander's name was a handwritten note stating that his political role had been voluntarily reduced for reasons of royal stability. Aidan remembered the novel. Alexander had always been described as distant and politically irrelevant, while Julian became the celebrated heir. The story had never explained why. This is wrong, Aidan whispered. He opened another file. It contained correspondence between senior advisors who had argued that Alexander's reputation as an intimidating alpha made him unsuitable for public leadership. They recommended emphasizing Julian's warmer personality and presenting Alexander as a distant figure who preferred military and diplomatic duties. They did not remove you from power, Aidan said slowly. They removed you from the story people were told about you. Alexander read the pages in silence. Then Aidan found something even stranger. An older royal chronicle contained a passage describing Alexander as a principal architect of early labor reforms and a supporter of independent property review. Those reforms had later been credited to Julian. Aidan stared at the page. The novel was not merely incomplete. Alexander looked at him. What do you mean? Aidan hesitated. He could no longer keep pretending his knowledge came from childhood expressions and lucky guesses. The version of this kingdom I remember was different. In that version, you were barely part of the main story. Julian became the central prince, and your choices were treated like background. Alexander did not laugh. He did not accuse Aidan of madness. He simply asked, and now? Aidan looked at the records surrounding them. Now I think someone wanted history to remember you differently. Alexander slowly closed the file. Then perhaps the wrong story was the problem all along. Aidan felt a strange chill. The letters, the trade memorandum, the inheritance proposal, Mercer's network, and Alexander's hidden political history were suddenly connected by one idea. People had been making decisions about others while controlling the information those people were allowed to see. That is why you never appeared in the version I remember, Aidan said. Someone benefited from making you invisible. Alexander's gaze remained steady. And you accidentally found me. Aidan smiled faintly. I seem to have a talent for sending things where they were never supposed to go. Alexander finally laughed. Then his expression softened. I am glad you did. Aidan looked down at the first letter Alexander had preserved. It had been intended for Julian, yet it had reached the one person who could understand what Aidan was trying to change. For the first time, the mistake no longer felt like an accident. It felt like the beginning of a story the novel had never been allowed to tell. Alexander offered his hand, not as a prince commanding an Omega, but as a man asking another man to stand beside him. Aidan accepted it. There is still one thing I do not understand, Aidan said. What? If the story I remember was deliberately incomplete, then why was I sent into it? Alexander considered the question. Neither of them had an answer. But this time, uncertainty did not feel like a threat. It felt like an invitation to discover the truth together. By the following morning, Aidan understood that finding the hidden history was only the beginning. If Alexander's role had been deliberately erased, then exposing the truth without evidence would accomplish nothing. They needed records that could survive political pressure, and they needed to make sure the reforms already underway could not simply be reversed when attention moved elsewhere. Alexander agreed immediately. Instead of relying on royal authority, they gathered the original chronicles, financial records, committee documents, and testimony from families affected by the old guardianship system. Independent clerks verified each document before it reached the Royal Civic Commission. The evidence revealed a consistent pattern. Years earlier, advisors had quietly redirected Alexander toward diplomatic duties while presenting Julian as the kingdom's more approachable future leader. Later, businesses connected to those advisors benefited from property arrangements and government contracts. No single document proved everything, but together they revealed something far more important than one person's wrongdoing. A system had been built around controlling who received information and who was allowed to make decisions. Lord Mercer was formally removed from the committee while a broader investigation continued. The inheritance proposal was rewritten to require independent review, and the old guardianship agreements were reopened wherever property rights had been transferred under questionable conditions. Alexander could have announced every reform by royal command, but he chose a different path. The new rules passed through the proper council and were published publicly so that ordinary citizens could understand their rights. Aidan became one of the advisors responsible for explaining those changes in plain language. He refused a title that would have made him known only as the prince's companion. Instead, he accepted a position within the civic office created to review complaints from Omegas and other citizens whose voices had previously been easy to ignore. One evening, months after the first letter had reached Alexander's desk, Aidan returned to the palace library. The same desk stood beside the same tall windows, but the room no longer felt like the beginning of someone else's story. Alexander was waiting with a small envelope in his hand. "I found something," he said. Aidan opened it and immediately recognized his own handwriting. It was the first letter, preserved exactly as it had arrived. "You kept this." "I kept all of them." Aidan smiled. "Even the embarrassing ones." "Especially those." Aidan shook his head. "You know, every letter was supposed to go to Julian." "I know." Alexander placed the first page on the table. "That mistake changed my life." Aidan looked at him. "Mine too." For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Aidan admitted the fear he had carried since waking in this world. "Sometimes I still wonder whether I am supposed to return to the life I came from." Alexander did not pretend to know the answer. "If that choice ever comes, I will not make it for you." Aidan's eyes softened. "You really mean that?" "I do." Alexander had once possessed a reputation for command, influence, and absolute confidence. Yet the strongest thing about him now was his willingness to leave another person's future in that person's own hands. Aidan reached for his hand. "Then I have something to choose." Alexander waited. "I want to stay. Not because the novel says I should. Not because I am an Omega and you are an Alpha. Not because the court expects it." Aidan smiled. "I want to stay because this is the first place where I have been allowed to become someone new." Alexander's expression softened. "And the letters? Those were a mistake. A regrettable one." Aidan laughed. "Not anymore." Alexander looked at the old page again. "Everyone else wrote to the prince they wanted me to be." He met Aidan's eyes. "You accidentally wrote to the man I actually was." Aidan squeezed his hand. Beyond the library windows, the capital continued changing, slowly and imperfectly. The kingdom had not become flawless, and neither had they. But people who had once been defined by titles were beginning to be judged by their choices. Aidan had entered this world believing his future had already been written. Alexander had lived inside a history that others had rewritten for him. Together, they had learned the same lesson. Destiny could be inherited, reputation could be manufactured, and power could be misused, but a person's choices still mattered. Aidan looked at the prince beside him and smiled. The story he remembered was gone. For the first time, he was grateful that it had been wrong.